Hey guys, I'd like to take you today through the biblical archaeological section of the museum. I know it's a section that a lot of you don't get to, and I want to show you what they have here. And maybe next time you come, that you'll put this on your schedule. So this is the biblical archaeology section of the museum. First off, we see when we come into it, actually back behind us, that's also considered part of the biblical archaeology, but it deals mostly with Canaanite stuff. And I prefer to focus on the Israelite and the biblical stuff. I want you to see these up here. A lot of you have seen copies of these at the City of David. They're the column heads that they found at the City of David, and these are the real ones. What's really interesting over here, right when you come in, this is the original Tel Dan inscription. And you can see there in white, they've kind of outlined it. It says Beit David, House of David. And if some of you need a little bit reminder, you probably heard the story in Tel Dan, that in the last day of the excavations, I think it was in 1995, one of the archaeologists there found this piece of stone in the wall there, and she thought it had some inscription on it. So they took it out and brushed it off and cleaned it up, and sure enough, it did. And this is a stone dated back to the 7th century that mentions, oldest mention of the house of David outside of the Bible. So why is this important? It's important because there were many scholars that were arguing, we call them minimalists, they were arguing that King David's kingdom wasn't so big, and it was just in Jerusalem and this kind of stuff. And when they found this stone and this inscription on the stone, which is actually not even an Israelite inscription, but it's an inscription by Hazael, king of Aram, and he mentions defeating the house of David. And it's actually really interesting because it's almost parallel to a chapter in the Bible that mentions Yehu, and here King Hazael takes credit for killing the Israelite kings and the kings of Judah, or the house of David. And in the Bible, it's actually Jehu who's mentioned with that. And I can look up that reference later. If we keep going over here, I think these are also from the City of David. This is kind of a cool thing. And the reign of Hezekiah, he destroyed a lot of the temples around the country and tried to centralize the worship in Jerusalem. And so what he does is he orders that everyone destroy their temples. So in Beersheba, till Beersheba, we'll find the altar there that's taken apart and just used in random walls. In Lachish, it was very interesting. We'll find there in a place where they had some kind of altar in the entrance to the city, we'll find a toilet. And apparently they never actually used the toilet, but they were showing that place there meant nothing to them. This altar is actually the stones they took from Tel Arad. Most of you probably haven't been there because it's to the south, and most of the groups don't go to the south. But this is from Tel Arad. Tel Arad is very interesting what they did there. They didn't destroy their temple. They actually had a whole temple complex. It was a pretty large altar. And then they also had a temple. And what you're looking at here is the Holy of Holies. In Tel Arad, you can see outside of this, there's another temple area. And this is like the Holy of Holies. Obviously, it's much smaller than the temple in Jerusalem. You'll see in the back they have two standing stones. And that's kind of interesting because the Bible talks a lot about Israelites making idols and worshiping God. So this is one of the ways that they did that. They would stand a stone up and worship God. And in this case, and in a lot of other cases, they would find two standing stones, one a little bit bigger than the other. Here, they have one standing stone in the wall. I'm not sure why that is, but here they have two standing stones. And this is also another way that they were trying to worship God like their neighbors were doing and like they had before. So they worship a God, and God had to have a wife. So they made a smaller stone here for God's wife. As you can see, also, these are incense altars at the front. So they have a big incense altar for the male god and a smaller incense altar for the female god. What's interesting, some of the other temples they found in the area, and even areas of modern Egypt today that was part of the Israelite worship system back then, is they found inscriptions that said Adonai Be'asharato. They say Adonai and his Asherah. So you remember the Asherah poles from Judges? So they took that goddess and made her a wife of God. And that's why they have a big stone and a little stone when they do this. One more interesting thing about these what are they called? About these incense altars is at the beginning of Corona, they decided to test what residue was in the top of this incense altar. And believe it or not, they actually found marijuana from almost 3,000 years ago, residue of marijuana from 2,700 years ago. So this is my theory, and this only works in English, but this is actually why they call these places the high places. That was a bit of a joke, but let's walk around here. There's a few other things here that I think are worthy of seeing. One, on the back wall here, we have the Lachish stele. And what this is, we have King Sennacherib, which actually you have him over here in the throne. The original stele the British took from Iraq. So this is the Nineveh stele. The original stele was found in Iraq and taken by the British to London. It's now in the British Museum in London. Here you can see Sennacherib up on his throne. And this is his story about him putting a siege and conquering the town of Lachish. Lachish was the largest city in the kingdom of Judah outside of Jerusalem. And you can see here there's ramps going up. And actually, if you're able to visit Lachish, which I know many of you weren't, there is actually, the ramp is still there. I mean, it's about 3,000 years old, but the remainder of it is still there. And this is really interesting because, one, you can see, obviously it's not, 3D or they didn't really know how to illustrate back then, but you get the idea of these guys going up a ramp, what weapons they were using, what's being thrown off of the walls at them. And most people think that these are probably torches being thrown at them. Then you can see after the Assyrians win, they are taking the spoil and the captives away. You can see a difference here between the Assyrians, who have pointed hats, and you see the Israelites, or the Hebrews, the Jews, if you will. You can see some of them that have the, I assume that's supposed to be curls, like curly hair with also beards. And then over here, some of them are bowing down to Sennacherib. There was some here that are supposed to be impaled prisoners, or they're dead. I don't know if they're considered prisoners anymore, but being brought to Sennacherib. And then you remember, of course, the story. He goes on to Jerusalem, fails to conquer Jerusalem, but there is another inscription that refers to Sennacherib keeping Hezekiah caged in like a bird in Jerusalem. And I see this as like a typical political spin. When a politician loses a ruler, loses a war, they try to put a spin on it as if they won. Just behind the Nineveh stele is something you've also seen or walked by. A lot of you walked by a copy of it without even knowing it. And this is also a copy. This is the inscription in Hezekiah's tunnel. It was found, let me think about this, I think in the late 1800s. The original is actually in Turkey, because the Ottomans dug the original off the wall and took it there. And we have a copy here in the Israel Museum. And basically this talks about them meeting different ends. And it mentions something about a crack, which goes along with my theory that Hezekiah's tunnel was done by following a crack already in the stone and widening it, and then getting the spring to flow through it. Another interesting thing about this inscription is who found it. So it was actually found by an adopted son of Horatio Spafford. And if that name sounds a little bit familiar, that's the author of It Is Well With My Soul. Some of you might remember his story a little bit. I don't really want to tell the whole story right here, right now, but what the circumstances that led him to read It Is Well With My Soul. And some of you may have told that I actually lived in the Spafford house in Jerusalem for a couple years when I was a student. Now let's walk over here now that there's nobody in this area. This is a really cool place. They did a model here of a burial cave, and I guess they did the best with the space that they had, but this section over here is really about these two amulets, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But the actual burial cave with these two amulets were found is much different than this one. It was much bigger. They even had like rows of where 3 people could be laid down, and where they left like headrests in that's not a real skeleton, by the way. They left headrest in the stone, because what they would do back then, don't think that a burial cave had such a huge entrance. Burial cave actually had an entrance, pretty much the top of it was about right here. It was about 2.5 by 2.5 feet, something like that. But here I can show you a little bit using this explanation, or this example here. So a person was buried. They were put into this hole, and a lot of times they would have kind of like beds laid out for them, lay them on the beds. Then they would close the tomb, like roll a stone in front of it. Some of you are familiar with that. And they would come back 10 months, a year later, and all the flesh would have rotted off the bones. And then they would gather up the stones and then put them in a room, or a lot of times in like an area underneath the bed, if I can call it that. And a lot of times there would be an entire room underneath the bed. They would go down further, and they would put the bones in there with the ancestors' bones. And there's a phrase in the Hebrew Bible that says, and he was gathered to his ancestors. And I think that's where this phrase came from, that the bones were actually gathered and put with the bones of his ancestors. Now, remember that hole underneath that, and I want to come over here. I want to tell you a little bit of a story. In 1982, there was an Israeli archaeologist, can't think of his name right now, it'll come to me. He was digging in the area opposite the old city, opposite what the Crusaders called Zion, Mount Zion, which we know in the Bible that Zion actually refers to Jerusalem, but the Crusaders called it Mount Zion. It's in the Hinnom Valley on the other side. And he was digging there, and those, they call it Ketef Hinnom, the shoulder of the Hinnom Valley. And there, the burial caves that were there, the ceiling was removed because the Ottomans were trying to build a railway there, and then they actually stumbled across or discovered the caves by accident. And so in 1982, the Israeli archaeologist was digging there. He was digging with youth volunteers. And he tells the story that this was one especially annoying 14-year-old who would come up behind him and pull his shirt all the time and ask him questions. So he got kind of annoyed with this kid, and he put him in an area like that underneath the bed with a hole in it, and he gave him a little brush, and he just told him to clean it up. And he left the kid there and went to somewhere else. So what happened was a few minutes later, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes later, he feels this pull on his shirt, and he turns around, and the kid is holding their 2 jugs like you see here. And the archaeologist is furious, because if you find something, you're not supposed to move it, and this kid wasn't even supposed to find anything where he was. So kind of what they think happened is that the other kids started making fun of this kid, and he somehow got a hold of a hammer and hit the floor. And when he hit the floor, he broke the floor, and he actually broke through the floor. And then he started moving things around and found a lot of different vessels and this kind of stuff. So what happened was either 2,700 years ago, they had either sealed it really, really well, or maybe even by accident, the ceiling or the underneath that part fell down and sealed that area perfectly. But you think it was sealed so well that it kept people from robbing that grave for 2,700 years. And so they began to dig out the stuff and take it out. And two of the things they found there were these two amulets. And these amulets are important because this is the oldest scripture that we've found. So this is scripture going back. It only has one has a verse for what we call the Aaronic blessing, and another has what we think is a combination of a few verses. And these go back to 8th century BC, 700s BC. And it's only a few verses, so the Dead Sea Scrolls are much more intact and have much more scripture in them. But they only go back to 250 BC, and a lot of them not even that old. So this is the oldest scripture that we have. Kind of pretty cool thing to see. Now if we go up here and go up the steps, really getting more to like the New Testament period. They have a few things here on Herod. Really interesting little video. There used to be a video here on the Hebrew language, but then we get to the Old Testament period. New Testament period. This is actually anchor that they found in the Dead Sea. So you can see all the salt that's around it that just built up over the hundreds of years, a couple thousands of years that it sat there. This is a restructured sarcophagus of Herod, and you'll see it was busted. Very few of the original stones were there. The rest of it there is part of his memorial that they found at Herodian that they brought here. This is also bathhouse, the Kaula room, the hot room in the bathhouse from Herodian. Looks very similar to others that you see in Masada and different places. Over here we have a few interesting things. Some of you may recognize this stone. You may have seen at Caesarea, a copy of it. This is a real one. This stone is interesting because in 1965 they found this stone being used as a step in the theater area of Caesarea. And before this time, they did not find any mention of Pontius Pilate outside of the New Testament. So some scholars thought that he was just fictitious, wasn't a real person, just kind of character they inserted into the New Testament. But this one, and you can barely see the remains of the inscription there, but this mentions Pontius Pilate, Prefectus Judea. So here's your mention outside of the New Testament of Pontius Pilate. It's not even, you're obviously talking about the prefect of Judea. You're talking about the same one. Again, I mentioned some of these ossuaries, a couple of them with Caiaphas, the high priest name. These jars over here are stone vessels that would have held water, let's say, for even perhaps a wedding. So if you want to think in John about Jesus' first miracle of turning water into wine at Cana, it would have happened in a stone jar like this. A couple more things over here. They're kind of cool. This stone right here is part of a larger stone and a number of stones that went around. It was a small wall that went around the temple. You can kind of see something there, but that looks more like steps. Like inside the temple complex, there was a small wall around the temple, let's say about where those steps in that illustration. And these stones, this wall, refer here to, it says, no non-Jews shall cross this point unless they shall forfeit their life pretty much. Now, obviously, when the Romans destroy the temple, they're going to destroy this too, and they were in control at the time. So, but that's something interesting I found there. This, some of you might look familiar to some of you. Down near the south western corner of the Temple Mount, there's a copy of this stone that's actually been put back on the original stone, but this is the original part with the inscription here, and it says there, Lebait Hatakia, and then we kind of miss the rest of it. But this is referring to that. They actually have a little man up there in the corner. This is a stone from that stone in the corner there. I don't want to say cornerstone to make you think something else, but this is a stone that was in the top in the corner, and it was a place where the person would blow the shofar to announce the Sabbath coming or another festival appointed time.